Our next speaker is Professor Nancy Eisenberg. She's a world-renowned leader and expert in developmental psychology with seminal contributions in longitudinal studies of social, emotional, psychological, and moral development in children. She has published more papers than you can count, way in excess of 500 articles, for instance. She was past president of Division 7 of the APA, that's developmental psychology, and she served on numerous editorial boards, but I want to mention just a few so you will know the extent of her impact on the field. She is the current editor. No, she was the editor of Child Development Perspectives. She was the editorial committee of annual reviews in psychology, and the acting editor of Psychological Bulletin. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Eisenberg.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here to honor Avi. I wish I was here for another reason, but about 4 years ago, I got an email out of the blue from Avi. I had never met him. I knew his name, but I really didn't know that much of his work because we were in different areas. And he kind of proposed an idea for a collaboration, and we emailed back and forth for a while and kind of to see where it would go, and decided to work on a grant. And Tracy Spinrad, who will talk next, got involved, and we did get the BSF grant. So we were about a year into it when Avi died, and we're trying to save the grant and get at least as much of the data as we can, because we know Avi really wanted this. This is a picture from last year when Avi came to visit at ASU. Waiting to the end was a good idea. Okay. I'm going to talk about self-regulation work, and in this grant, self-regulation was a new area, I think, for him. He wanted to look at the sleep reactivity, parents' reactions to self-regulation and empathy in the first 2 years of life. So I'm going to talk about the self-regulation and how it relates to empathy, and Tracy's going to talk about pro-social behavior, which is part of the whole idea too. Recently, Joel Nigg published a paper that I think is really excellent, where he tried to come up with some common terminology for various ideas in the self-regulation literature. I must admit, my terminology was a little bit different, but I think the distinctions, I've always argued it's the distinctions that are important, not so much the label you apply. And I'm going to use his terminology because I think it's good, and I think we all need to get on the same page. So he defines self-regulation as intrinsic processes aimed at adjusting mental and physiological state adaptively to context. It encompasses cognitive control, emotion regulation, and top-down and bottom-up processes that alter emotion, behavior, or cognition to attempt to enhance adaptation or to achieve an explicit or inexplicit goal or goal state. It also involves physiological systems, encompasses strategic and deliberate, as well as reactive and automatized processes and their reciprocal influences. What I think is the important distinction then, he's using self-regulation in a very broad way, but he also differentiated, as we have and others for many years, between top-down and bottom-up processes. Top-down processes are slow, capacity limited, insequential. They respond to mental representations such as a goal or a rule rather than pure sensory stimuli. Imaging and single-cell recording data link them to feed backward neural signaling. That's signaling from the cortex to the subcortex or the anterior to posterior cortical functioning. Now, top-down self-regulation, defined in this way, is built on what Mary Rothbard has labeled as temperamental effortful control. She defines it as the efficacy of executive attention, including the ability to inhibit a dominant response and or activated subdominant response to plan and detect errors. I think it's actually a little broader than that, and I like Nigg's definition of effortful control actually better than Mary's. A dispositional trait-level representation that represents the tendency to be able to employ top-down control to self-regulate. It's seen as emerging from one aspect of executive functioning, executive attention, but also with development, including other capacities. So effortful control is really the dispositional building blocks, dispositional basis of top-down self-regulation. And often I'll be using the term effortful control because that's what people often measure in the research. So effortful controls includes effortful control of attention, like the ability to shift and focus attention as needed to adapt even if you don't feel like it, and also effortful or willful control of behavior, inhibiting and activating behavior as needed in planning. So effortful control, by definition, is willful and voluntary. Now, I would argue, and I have argued, that it can sometimes be semi-automatic, that automatic may not really be the big differentiation between top-down and bottom-up. I kind of think of it like driving a car at the very beginning. It takes a lot of effort to work out, you have to be really thinking and learning and very consciously doing behaviors. It becomes more automatic. However, if you get up and you're on an icy road, you can very quickly shift into effortful functioning. So for me, it's more, I think it can go into semi-automatic. What's important is how quickly it can shift out of automatic into willful and top-down. Now, this concept of top-down self-regulation overlaps a lot with executive functioning. I would argue there's some minor differences, but I don't know that that's important today. Okay, then you have the bottom-up self-regulation. That's generally automatic, stimulus-driven, rapid, and doesn't require much mental resource, elicited by sensory stimuli. And again, the human brain imaging and animal single-cell recording studies link it to the feed-forward neural signaling from subcortical to cortical or posterior to anterior cortical signaling. Now, this concludes what we've used the term reactive control in the past for this bottom-up aspects of behavioral aspects of control that are pretty involuntary. Now, this distinction between effortful and reactive systems is, many people have talked about this in different ways. We were talking about it, 15 years ago. Carver wrote some very good papers where he uses the terms impulse versus constraint. Hoffman and a number of people in neuroscience are making similar distinctions. Okay, on the bottom, reactive control, again, I'm using for the bottom-up processes, the less voluntary. We've talked about two kind of conceptual endpoints, so different types of reactive control. On the one end, conceptually, you have reactive under control. It's basically impulsivity, where the person is pulled by environmental cues or rewards. The attention is captured by salient stimuli without much thought. So the child just kind of is attracted by something and out there, runs into the street or whatever. Then you have reactive over-control. Some of you may know Bloch's classic work on ego over-control. It's really this kind of concept. Rigid, constrained behavior, typically inflexible, such as Jerome Kagan talked about behaviorally inhibited kids who were really rigid. They're the kids that hide in the corner and they can't seem to make themselves do anything, like join in with other kids, deal with novel stimuli. And notice that behavioral inhibition, though, is not the same as inhibitory control. Inhibitory control, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, is an aspect of effortful control, top down, while behavioral inhibition is this rigid, involuntary kind of behavior. So this reactive over-control often includes anxious interruption of behavior in response to novelty. And again, it's the kids that are timid, constrained, and lack flexibility, particularly with novelty. Now, in thinking about self-regulation, I like this quote, old quote of Pamela Cole's. Well-regulated people have the ability to respond to the ongoing demands of experience with a range of responses that are socially acceptable and sufficiently flexible to allow for spontaneity as well as for the delay of spontaneous responses as needed. So this flexibility and being able to turn it on and off is very important. So based on this kind of idea, we've argued that top-down self-regulation or effortful control is usually adaptive, but not always. You can use effortful control certainly for maladaptive goals, but particularly in non-clinical samples, you'd expect it to usually lead to good functioning. Reactive control is sometimes, in some situations, adaptive, but often because of its inflexibility, it's not very adaptive. Now, a number of people have talked about, interesting, how the neural correlates of top-down and bottom-up regulation differ. Top-down self-regulation, and I'm going to start just saying self-regulation rather than having to say top-down every time, is believed to be based in the anterior cingulate gyrus and prefrontal cortex. There's a lot of work on these kinds of areas. Gray and others have argued that reactive systems are associated particularly with subcortical systems, for instance, the limbic system for over-control. But of course, these systems are related in many and complex ways. So let me talk just a bit about what is typically measured when people assess top-down self-regulation or effortful control in children. There's many different constructs and methods, which of course makes it a little difficult sometimes to compare, but typically people use others like teachers or parents' reports. Older kids can report on their effortful control, and of course adults. And there's a host of behavioral measures of top-down self-regulation, delay of gratification tasks, a lot of executive function tasks where people have to control attention. So, sample items for executive attentional control, and I'm taking some items from Mary Rothbard's CBQ to give you a feeling for what the items are like. Attention focusing becomes very absorbed in what he or she is doing and works for long periods. This is supposed to be attention shifting, has an easy time leaving play to come to dinner. So being able to stop doing something you're enjoying to do something else. The behavioral tasks include many Stroop or flanker type computer tasks where the person has to control attention and just ignore distractors and so forth. Now, inhibitory control is the capacity to effortfully suppress inappropriate responses. So, for instance, can lower his or her voice when asked to do so, can wait before entering new activities if asked to do so. The behavioral tasks probably are not pure, in that all of them probably get at attention and behavior, many of them to some degree. But a typical task would be, I don't know if you have Simon Says games here, you know, where the child has to do something with one command and not do it on another command with another cue. Delay of gratification tasks where children have to not take something they want. And then there's some executive functioning tasks that probably get somewhat at inhibitory control, and I'll talk about this task in a moment. Activational control hasn't been studied as much, but it's the capacity to perform an action when there's a tendency to avoid it. So to work on your dissertation or a grant proposal or whatever on Saturday morning or Sunday morning or whatever is activation control. When asked to do something, does it right away, even if he or she doesn't want to. Behavioral tasks, people haven't really worked much on coming up with behavioral tasks, but I think some of the persistence tasks that we've used probably get at activation control, where children are having to do a boring and difficult task, but they could quit, they could do something more interesting, but they persist. This is, I'm just going to walk you through a couple examples. The tapes take too long. A typical delay of gratification task, the child's asked to put their hands on the picture of the hands, and you can't see it here, but there's a cup like this with candy or some desirable treat under it. And the child's told they have to wait to take the treat till the experimenter rings a bell. So the experimenter brings it up and holds it for a while and eventually rings the bell, and there's different timings. So you code how quickly the child takes the candy. The knock-tap task is a very common one. Originally it's an executive functioning task where the child is first taught. The experimenter says, when I tap on the table, you tap on the table. When I knock-tap, so knock, when I tap with my hand, you tap. So the child learns to do what the experimenter is doing. And then the instructions are reversed. When I knock on the table, you tap. When I tap, you knock. And then there's a series of fairly fast trials where the child has to do the opposite of what the experiment is doing. That'll give you a flavor for some of the tasks. Now, all this differentiation would be of little interest if we couldn't differentiate empirically between effortful and reactive control, or top-down and bottom-up. And 3 different studies with different samples, we've used confirmatory factor analysis to show that having 2 constructs, the effortful control top-down versus bottom-up, is better than 1 construct empirically. And in one study, we had 3 constructs. We had the effortful control, we had the over control, and the under control, okay, on the bottom-up. And we found that we had the 2 constructs, the effortful control and the reactive, at 30 months, but we didn't have 3. But by 42 months and at 54 months, we actually had 3 distinct constructs that we could measure, and that was the best fitting model. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about individual differences in...
Better?
Okay. How can we think about individual differences, and particularly the top-down, but also the bottom-up, self-regulation and their implications for adjustment and maladjustment. When we started in this area, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, we came up with a kind of broad heuristic model to help us think about it. And we thought about different types of kids. So you could have that highly inhibited kid. And that's the kid you'd expect to be high in this less voluntary reactive over control, the behaviorally inhibited child. You'd expect the children maybe to be a bit low, but maybe not that low in the ability to effortfully inhibit behavior. These kids are so over-controlled that it may not be such an issue. And we expected them to be low in effortful attentional control because attention is used to modulate emotion. And we know that these kids...
But how about we switch to this? Right. No, just stand back.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Okay, so I was talking about how these highly inhibited kids we'd expect to be low in attentional control because that's used to modulate negative emotion. And we know that behaviorally inhibited kids tend to be prone to fear and anxiety. We'd expect these kids to be low in the ability to effortfully activate behavior as needed, the activation control, and in planful active coping. I see coping as an aspect of self-regulation. And of course, you'd expect these kids to be prone to internalizing problems, anxiety, depression, social withdrawal, especially if they're high, particularly high on temperamental negative emotionality also. Now, under-controlled kids, in contrast, you'd expect to be low in all types of the effortful top-down processes: attentional control, inhibitory control, activational control, planning, because they have difficulty using these to manage their behavior. We'd expect them to be high in the reactive approach tendencies, the impulsivity. And of course, kids with this configuration, you'd expect to be low in social competence and prone to externalizing problems such as reactive aggression, emotionally driven aggression. And then you have the optimally regulated kids, where you'd expect to be high in all the various modes of top-down self-regulation because they can use it when they need it and they can be spontaneous when they don't need it. In regard to reactive control, you wouldn't expect them to be at either extreme, not highly over-controlled nor highly under-controlled. And of course, these children should be well-adjusted, socially competent, and resilient to stress because they have all these tools they can use to adapt. So just to state it a little bit differently when thinking about maladjustment, we'd expect externalizing problems to be linked to low effortful control or top-down self-regulation processes of all types, and they'd be high in impulsivity. Internalizing problems should be, we hypothesized, associated with low attentional and activational control and high reactive over-control, or perhaps very low impulsivity that might reflect high reactive over-control. Okay, I'm going to switch now to talking about empirical findings. In general, The last 20 years there's been a ton of research on self-regulation. Before that there was surprisingly very little. Top-down effortful control processes have been associated with a wide range of positive outcomes for kids. Quite consistently with low externalizing problems, often with low levels of internalizing problems, though the findings are somewhat more mixed, as you'll see. Kids that are high in effortful top-down should be higher in social competence, and they are. They show higher conscience development, pro-social development, sympathy, better school performance, more engagement at school, and so on. But we've tried to get into it a bit more. For instance, we focused on looking at different components of effortful control and how they play out with adjustment. Looking at, do you get unique predictive effects of top-down and bottom-up processes? If you don't get them, at least at some ages, it doesn't seem very useful to make the distinction. Are there interactions of the top-down processes with either the bottom-up reactive processes or perhaps with negative emotionality? What are some of the mediators of effortful control processes to child outcomes? Relations of a question people have been looking at particularly more recently, relations of the top-down effortful processes with co-occurring externalizing and internalizing problems versus where someone just has pure internalizing problems or just externalizing problems. And of course, it's very important to use, I don't have to tell most of you, multiple reporters and methods and longitudinal data, but that wasn't done till, till the last 15 years or so. Okay, I'm going to give you some sample findings. Is it still doing?
No, it's better.
Okay. This study we started in first publication in 2001. We had kids who were almost all 5 to 7 years of age. They were selected so that we made sure we had a number of kids with externalizing problems, with internalizing problems, and everything in between. We had mothers, fathers, and teachers reports of externalizing and internalizing problems on the CBCL. We had parents and teachers reports, one parent, of Rothbard's effortful control scales. We also had some at 5 to 7 observed measures of top-down self-regulation. For instance, we had children hooked up to physiological equipment that we were using for another purpose, and we got them all hooked up, said, please don't move, it'll come off. We leave the room and we videotape what they do. And it's a great measure with young kids because they sit there and pull the cords and wiggle their fingers and whatever. So you just code their movements. We had Sarni's disappointing gift task where the child's expecting a great gift and they get something awful, a baby rattle or whatever. And then we had a persistence task where kids are doing this difficult puzzle and they have to stick their hands through a sweatshirt that's hanging there and do the puzzle without looking. However, they could cheat by lifting it, and they're left alone. We can see what's going on with our hidden cameras. So we looked at how much they persisted versus giving up or cheating. So from the reports of the multiple reporters, we constructed 4 groups of children for each type of reporter. We had externalizing children, those that were high just in externalizing but not internalizing. Internalizing children, high in internalizing but not externalizing. Co-occurring, high in both. And then the control non-disordered that were below borderline 60 on the CBCL on both. And back then, they didn't have some of the new techniques for these kinds of groupings. What we found is that the externalizing kids and the co-occurring kids meaning they had the externalizing and internalizing both, didn't differ much on the regulation part of the study. They were low in attention shifting and focusing. They were low in inhibitory control. They were high in impulsivity. They were less regulated on 2 of the observational tasks. And this was a really strong pattern that was across reporters, across measures. It was one of the strongest patterns I've ever gotten. Now, the pure internalizing kids, in comparison to non-disordered kids, was somewhat lower at age 5 to 7 in attention shifting and attention focusing. Not as strong a pattern as externalizing kids, but they were lower. They were really low in impulsivity. Now, we didn't have a measure back then of over-control, and we think the impulsivity measure to some degree picked that up. They were about the same as the non-disordered kids in reported inhibitory control and also on the behavioral tasks. So they didn't have a problem really with the inhibitory control, but they had a problem with the attentional control. So just to summarize, the externalizers were low in attentional and inhibitory control and high in impulsivity. The internalizers were very low in impulsivity, below control kids, and low in effortful attentional control, but not inhibitory control. Okay, 2 and 4 years later, we did a follow-up with many of the same measures. What did we find? Same pattern for the externalizing kids. They still clearly were low in top-down self-regulation and high in impulsivity. And change in externalizing status, moving in or out of that status, was related to changes in effortful control and impulsivity in predictable ways. So, if a kid became more impulsive or less effortfully controlled, they, would tend to become worse on externalizing. Now, for internalizing on the 2 and 4 year follow-up, interestingly, the pure internalizers, we found no association anymore with attentional problems. The attentional regulation, shifting and focusing. And they still didn't, again, they didn't show deficits in inhibitory control, inhibiting the cells. They were very low still, though, in impulsivity, looking over-controlled. And change in internalizing status was linked to change in impulsivity. So if they became more impulsive, they actually went down in internalizing problems, okay? That was a good thing for these kids. And at 4 years, we had some hints, some findings, but not a lot, showing that attentional control was predicting change to some degree. Now, the 6 year follow-up, we did something different. Now we had bifactor models. These provide unique continuous factors. We didn't have to cut them into groups based on an arbitrary cutoff on the CBCL. So we could use continuous measures of internalizing and externalizing and looking at the co-occurrence. We found that both pure externalizing and co-occurring problems were predicted by low effortful control and high impulsivity, both as measured in childhood, predicting 6 years later in adolescence the effortful control or impulsivity, and also as measured concurrently in adolescence. Okay? And in the cross time, we controlled for earlier symptoms. So the early effortful control and impulsivity were predicting basically change in a sense in externalizing. Now the pure internalizers, they were predicted, pure internalizing in adolescence was predicted by low childhood and early adolescence low impulsivity, but not effortful control. So if the child was low in impulsivity 6 years earlier or concurrently, they were likely to have these pure internalizing problems. We actually, though, also got an interaction. We looked at quality of parent-positive expressivity in the home, and this was parent-reported, but we got an interaction such that Lower effortful control predicted changes in externalizing, both pure and co-occurring over the 6 years, but only when the positive parenting was lower. So if positive parenting was good, was higher, we didn't get as much. We didn't get as much effect of effortful control. Now this is an entirely different sample. It's a higher risk sample even. Laurie Chasson has a study of kids of alcoholics. This is the kids of alcoholics, so the next generation. And they were initially assessed at 5 to 10 years of age in the effortful control and impulsivity, and then assessed again 5 to 6 years later on aggressive antisocial behavior and depressive symptoms. Okay? We found that the low for aggressive antisocial behavior was predicted by low effortful control. And again, we were controlling for somewhat earlier symptoms. Now, for pure depression and for co-occurring depression and externalizing, not only they were predicted again by low effortful control, but also by low impulsivity. So here we're getting more of a pattern of effortful control predicting internalizing symptoms than in our other sample. We also looked at the interaction of effortful control with impulsivity. And we found that the low effortful control predicted the aggressive antisocial symptoms or the co-occurring symptoms only when children were average or high in impulsivity. So if kids were really low in impulsivity, the effortful control wasn't a significant predictor. So when kids had some impulsivity issues, effortful control was important. Now, again, here we found some findings, more findings for for internalizing problems being predicted by effortful control and top-down processes. We don't know why in this study versus the other, but it could be that by mid-adolescence, when there's more depression and so forth, effortful control kicks in again, more with pure internalizing. It could be that certain kinds of internalizing problems are better predicted by top-down processes. This study had depression. Our other study, depressive symptoms were only only a part of the measure of internalizing problems. Or it may be that effortful control is a better predictor of pure internalizing problems in really high-risk samples. Okay, those findings are all in the U.S. What do we find in other countries? Those findings in at least a couple labs have done quite a bit of work in Europe, looking at similar kinds of relations between impulsivity or effortful control and maladjustment. And for the most part, they've gotten a similar pattern, although Oldenhinkel and Muris more often have found relations between pure internalizing and low effortful control than we have. And in Indonesia, we find that effortful control is related to externalizing problems. In China, we get a little bit different pattern. This was using many of the same measures as in the U.S. We find that both at about the same age, kind of mid-elementary school, we found that both internalizing and externalizing symptoms were related to low attention focusing and low inhibitory control. Now remember in the U.S., at the younger age, 5 to 7, kids with internalizing problems had low attention focusing, but then it kind of washed out. And they never showed a problem in inhibitory control. In China, we find that these kids do. They have kids with not only externalizing, but internalizing are showing reported to be low in effortful control, including both attention and inhibitory control. We don't know really why, but I think self-regulation is particularly valued in China. Maybe not having it has more severe consequences in how you're viewed. Maybe teachers and parents are more attuned to reporting these things. I don't know. But it seems that regulation is particularly important there. Just as in the United States, the internalizing group was lower than control children. The internalizing group was lower than controls and externalizers in impulsivity. So that finding was the same in China as in the United States. That really low impulsivity seems to be an issue. Okay, now in addition, we've been interested, as I said, in additive and mediated relations. So we found that at some ages, at least, prediction of socio-emotional outcomes tends to be greater when you use both effortful control or top-down processes and bottom-up processes as simultaneous predictors. You get unique prediction. They overlap some, but there's also unique prediction. And also, we've been interested in looking at personality resilience. This is Bloch's ego resilience, the ability to cope with and rebound from stress. We've looked at it as a mediator of the relations of top-down processes to various socio-emotional outcomes for children. So we've used structural equation models. This was time one when kids were 5 to 7 years of age, and this particular study, it's the same sample, but that I talked about a bit ago, but here we had continuous variables. We don't have it broken out by pure and co-occurrence. You know, when you use continuous measures in models, if you're not doing a bifactor, which I don't think existed back when we did this, you can't get at pure symptoms. But anyway, we had multiple predictors of effortful control, multiple reporters of resiliency, internalizing, externalizing, and impulsivity. At time one, you find that effortful control predicts resiliency. Effortful control predicts higher resilience, which in turn predicts lower internalizing. Effortful control, of course, also negatively predicts externalizing. Impulsivity predicts higher externalizing, of course. But interestingly, impulsivity predicted higher resilience, which I'll come back to, and resilience predicts lower internalizing. So we do have some unique predictions, suggesting that you get more variance accounted for with two predictors, both top-down and bottom-up. Now, at time two, we had the exact same pattern. And, you know, we would do this model differently if this paper was published today. The kind of ways that we do it are a little different, but this is how people were doing it back in 2003. Time two, we got the exact same pattern. However, impulsivity to externalizing was only marginally significant. This correlation was quite high. But when you controlled for effortful control, the relation between impulsivity and externalizing started to drop out as a unique relationship, even though there was definitely a correlation. Now this is time one and time two. Again, we probably do a panel model a little differently today, but it gets to the point. This is time one, as you saw before, just sideways. Time two. But we have autoregressive path accounting for stability of the constructs. And what you find at time two, time one's the same pattern as before. Time two, when you control for effortful control as well as stability, the path between impulsivity and externalizing drops out completely. Again, there's a correlation there, but the path drops out. So something got out of order here. Okay. Anyway, so what it tells us is that there's continuing, it looks like it looks like, obviously it's a correlational model in essence, but there's continuing predictive effects on the outcomes over 2 years, but the unique effect of impulsivity on externalizing drops out. As children are getting older, the effortful control is providing better prediction than the impulsivity of externalizing. Now, going back to that, remember that positive relation between impulsivity, impulsivity and resilience. We get that not because impulsive kids are more resilient, but we get it for this reason. The average and the high impulsive kids are really very similar. It's those over-controlled kids are causing the relationship. So the kids that are over-controlled are real low in impulsivity. They're the ones that are low in resilience. So we actually had a quadratic and a linear relationship. Okay, I'm going to move ahead a bit. What do we find? I've been talking about maladjustment up to now. What do we find in terms of predicting social competence? In one study that Tracy was first author on, we used 2 years at 5 to 7. Oh, let me say one thing about that past pattern. For the externalizing behavior, the one I just talked about, we replicated that in a totally different sample, the exact same pattern of prediction by externalizing, prediction of externalizing by impulsivity, dropping out unique prediction over time. So effortful control was a stronger predictor. Okay, for social competence, when we looked at 2 times, 2 years apart, we find that effortful control predicts, and we use the Cole and Maxwell mediational model for 2 times. Effortful control predicts resiliency, which in turn predicts popularity. But we also got some unique prediction from impulsivity. Impulsivity was uniquely negatively related to popularity over time. In the preschool years, we find that effortful control predicts committed compliance with adults, kind of good behavior, eager to follow the rules. In preschoolers, we found that effortful control predicts higher resilience, which predicts preschoolers' agreeableness. However, you got to keep in mind that there might be bidirectional relations. And in fact, in a recent study, we had peer acceptance at 2 times, and we had effortful control at 2 times, and we did a cross-lag panel model. And we actually found, and we didn't predict this, we thought it'd be bidirectional maybe, that peer acceptance predicted effortful control, and this was in kindergarten rather than vice versa. So it might be something about the kindergarten experience, and kids are, in a peer group, some of them for the first time, and so on. But we do think that there's probably bidirectional relations, probably in many cases. Okay, I'm going to have to move through this really quickly. And Tracy's going to talk more about empathy. But empathy, I want to talk a little more because this is a core part of the grant that we're looking at. Empathy is an affective response that stems from the apprehension or comprehension of another's emotional state or condition, but similar to what the other person's feeling. You're sad, I feel sad, empathy. Okay, sympathy is also an emotional response stemming from the apprehension or comprehension of another's emotional state or condition. But it's not feeling the same emotion as the other person. It's feeling sorrow or concern for the other person. Personal distress, first discussed by Dan Batson, is a self-focused aversive affective reaction to the apprehension of another's emotional state. Okay. Is sympathy related to effortful control? We originally predicted, based on some of Dan Batson's work, that empathic arousal would lead to more aversive negative emotion that would lead to a self-focus, personal distress. And if that's true, people who are able to manage their negative emotion should be higher on sympathy. People who can't manage their emotion very well and are exposed to evocative situations, which should be more prone to personal distress, because it's going to be high evocative arousal and it's going to be aversive. So I'm just going to run through this pretty quickly. Actually, I started a little later, about 35 after. We found, so we predicted that factors that contribute, that effortful control kinds of factors should predict sympathy, as well as negative emotionality should predict, and that these things might even interact. Concretely, we predicted that effortful control would be related in a positive linear fashion to sympathy. The low effortful control would predict personal distress, and that effortful control and a tendency to experience intense emotion should interact in predicting sympathy. In studies, several studies with college students and elderly, we found that a very persistent finding was that personal distress is negatively related to top-down self-regulation processes, also to friends' reports of coping. Sympathy was either simply positively related to regulation, or in one or two of the studies, there was that positive linear relation when we controlled for individual differences in negative emotionality. In kids, in a variety of studies, we found evidence supporting the predictions. In one longitudinal study, children reported to be sympathetic by adults, or who self-reported being sympathetic, were viewed by adults as high in top-down self-regulation within time and across time. Children's reports of in another longitudinal study, children's reports of responding with sympathy to an empathy-inducing film were related to self and teacher-reported self-regulation, whereas reports of personal stress were negatively related to self-regulation. We found that behavioral measures of self-regulation often predicted sympathy concurrently across time. And again, in Indonesia, we replicate the positive relation between sympathy and self-regulation. We've also found in a couple studies, not all studies, but some, the interaction of effortful control and emotionality. And what we find is that for kids who tend to be high, or at least average in self-regulation, sympathy increased with a general intense emotionality. So kids who were the most sympathetic were actually fairly emotional, but they were also highly regulated. So they would feel the emotion, but they could modulate it. Okay, what do people find in other countries related to social competence? In China, we find that kids high in effortful control are perceived as socially skilled, as leaders at school. In Indonesia, effortful control is related to high social competence. In Italy, in a longitudinal study, kids that effortful control reported by teachers at age 13 predicted higher prosocial behavior at age 13, and also a later normative decline in prosocial behavior. The kids tend to decline in prosocial behavior for a while, but the kids who were high in effortful control, it happened later. And in that same Italian study, we find that relation between effortful control and prosocial behavior is mediated by personality resilience from 16 to 26 years of age in the mediational design. How about relations with school functioning? Self-regulation's been fairly consistently in the last 5 to 10 years Can I go 5 minutes? That'll be an hour, okay. Related to greater school liking, better behavior at school, higher grades, more engagement, all these good academic outcomes. And this relationship is sometimes mediated. In one study in preschoolers, we found that kids that were high in self-regulation at the first assessment, a few months later, had better relationships with their teachers, and then later in the year, they were higher in school liking. In a study with elementary school kids, we find the kids who early in elementary school were higher in effortful control, 2 years later are higher in social competence and lower in externalizing behavior at school, and then 2 years later they're higher in grades. So these may be some of the relationships and the behavior in the classroom, maybe some of the mediating processes between self-regulation and academic kinds of outcomes. Okay, an interesting question, I'll summarize this real quickly, I'm almost done, is does these top-down processes interact with emotionality? I gave you one example for sympathy, but in general, to predict developmental outcomes. And we do find this often when we've looked. And typically, depending on which is the moderator, if emotion is the moderator, what you find is effortful control is a better predictor of a variety of outcomes for kids that are prone to negative emotion. If they're not prone to negative emotion, they have fewer problems, okay? And effortful control is not so important. If you switch it, and some studies we've had effortful control as the moderator, effortful control is more important. Negative emotion predicts bad outcomes for kids, but particularly for kids that are not regulated, okay? I'm just going to give you one example here, and this is the final thing. In a recent study we did with academic outcomes, we had observations. I mean, kids were observed most of the semester in school, in the recesses, in the lunch, in the classroom, to get at their emotion. We had teachers' reports of conflict with the students, teachers' reports of problem behavior at school, and observed engagement in the classroom. Regulations measured in the fall. We also had a behavioral task to get at regulation that was on the latent construct. It was part of the composite. And we found a number of interactions. First of all, for direct effects, we found, as you'd expect, that top-down regulation predicted all good school outcomes. You know, negative emotionality predicted bad school outcomes. But we also had a number of interactions. Positive affect didn't predict much, actually, but negative did. The interactions were mostly of this sort, that kids who were high in effortful control were doing well regardless, okay? But for kids who were average or lower in effortful control, so that's the high effortful control, kids that were average or low in effortful control, higher negative emotionality was related to worse school outcomes. Lower engagement, more conflict, more problem behaviors in class. Okay, so in summary, individual differences in self-regulation and in the reactive bottom-up processes do provide sometimes unique prediction of adjustments, social competence, academic outcomes. Effortful control, at least with some outcomes, seems to become the kind of overriding stronger predictor with age, particularly for externalizing problems. Things like personality resilience, quality of relationships, also coping efficacy in other studies we find are mediators of some of the relations between regulation and child outcomes. Often we get interactions between emotionality, particularly negative emotionality, and regulation and predicting outcomes. And finally, let me just say that parenting is also important. I couldn't talk about that today. But despite the fact that effortful control has a strong genetic basis, we often find that the effects, predictive effects of parenting are mediated through children's effortful control over time on outcomes like social competence and adjustment. And in some of the studies, we have bi-directional relationships. Sometimes we have child effects only, and it depends on the context. And these relations vary depending on the age of the child, the type of parenting, and the developmental outcome. So these are some of the many collaborators who have worked on some of the studies I talked about. Thank you.